The first thing I smelled wasn't the copper of my own blood or the acrid smoke of the airbag. It was the sterile, biting scent of hospital-grade floor wax. I was lying on a gurney, my world a blur of rhythmic, blue emergency lights and the frantic shouting of paramedics. My abdomen felt like it was being crushed by a hydraulic press, a deep, radiating heat that told me my body was failing from the inside out. I'm a doctor. I knew the signs. I was bleeding internally. I was drifting toward a shore I wasn't ready to reach. But as the pain spiked and the monitors chirped with a desperate, mounting urgency, I didn't think about the surgery. I didn't think about the metal that had just screamed against metal. I thought about Lily and Lucas. 3 years old. Home with a babysitter who had a heart out at 8 p.m. because she had her own finals to study for. It was 7:15. In 45 minutes, my children would be alone in a house with no one to guard the door. My hands were shaking, slippery with a mixture of sweat and blood as I fumbled for my phone. Every breath felt like a jagged piece of glass in my lungs. I pulled up our family group chat. I didn't call, I didn't have the breath to explain. I typed a frantic message. I'd been in a bad accident. Going into emergency surgery. Internal bleeding. Please, I need someone to get the twins from the sitter. Please. I watched the screen. The little gray bubbles danced. They were active. They were there. I waited for the surge of panic from my mother, the on my way from my father, the don't worry, I've got them from my sister Vanessa. I waited for the family I had spent 8 years carrying to finally carry me back. Then, the notification pinged. One message from my mother. I blinked, trying to clear the haze from my eyes. Myra, you've always been such a nuisance and a burden, it read. We're literally pulling into the parking lot for the Taylor Swift concert with Vanessa. We've had these tickets for months. Figure it out yourself. I stared at the screen until the words burned into my retinas. A second message followed from my father. You're a doctor. You're used to hospitals. Stop making this a bigger deal than it needs to be. We'll talk tomorrow. And then, a final notification from Vanessa. No words. Just a laughing emoji. The phone slipped from my hand, clattering onto the floor of the ambulance. My heart, already struggling to pump through the trauma, felt like it had finally hit a wall. I wasn't just a nuisance to them. I wasn't just the practical daughter. I was a ghost they only acknowledged when they needed a check. And as the paramedic, Marcus, leaned over me with a look of profound, silent pity, having seen the screen over my shoulder, I realized that if I died on that operating table, my parents wouldn't be mourning a daughter. They'd be mourning a bank account. To understand how a mother can tell her dying daughter to figure it out yourself, you have to understand the Carver household hierarchy. In our family, love wasn't a given, it was a ranking system. At the top was Vanessa. My older sister, the visionary, the artist. She wanted to be a fashion designer, and when she announced it, my parents reacted as if she'd discovered a cure for a plague. They poured every ounce of their emotional energy into her fragile spirit. Then there was me. Myra. The one who wanted to be a cardiologist. When I told my father I'd been accepted into medical school, he didn't look up from his newspaper. He just said, that's practical. Practical meant invisible. Practical meant I didn't need the front row seats at fashion shows or the 5-star hotels in New York that my parents insisted on for Vanessa's mental health. I fought for every scholarship, stayed up until my eyes bled over textbooks, and clawed my way into a top-tier residency. I told myself it didn't matter that they showed up 2 hours late to my graduation because Vanessa had a crisis with an investor. I told myself that my stability was my strength. I was wrong. My stability was their opportunity. It started 8 years ago. I'd just landed my first real paycheck as a resident. My father called, his voice thick with a fake, practiced shame. Myra, things are just so tight this month. The mortgage. I'd hate for us to lose the house. Just this once? Just this once is the most dangerous lie a family can tell you. I sent the $2,400. I felt a surge of pride, thinking I was finally being the good daughter, the one who could actually help. But within 6 months, that one-time bridge became an automatic transfer. Then came the health insurance. Then the car repairs. Then Vanessa's seed money for a studio she never actually opened. I became the silent engine of their life. I paid for the roof over their heads while they lived in a world where I was a nuisance. I kept a spreadsheet, maybe as a masochistic reminder, maybe as a sanity check. $2,400 for the house. $800 for their premiums. $500 here, $1,000 there. Over 8 years, it added up to more than $300,000. Even when I got pregnant and the twins' father vanished into the sunset, I didn't stop the payments. I was working 80-hour shifts, nursing newborns in the hospital break room, and studying for board exams on 3 hours of sleep. I reached out to them then, begging for a little help with the kids. "Oh, honey," my mother had said over the phone while I could hear the sounds of a luxury spa in the background. "We wish we could, but Vanessa is so stressed about her new collection. She really needs us in Milan right now. You're so strong, Myra. You'll figure it out." I did figure it out. I always figured it out. But lying there in the ER, with Marcus squeezing my hand and a surgeon prep squad hovering over me like vultures, I realized the cost of being strong. It meant being the person everyone felt comfortable abandoning. The surgery took 4 hours. A ruptured spleen is a messy, violent thing, and I was told later that I was minutes away from a permanent sleep. But as I woke up in the recovery wing, the fog of morphine drifting through my brain, I didn't feel the relief of a survivor. I felt the cold, hard weight of a decision that had finalized itself while I was under the knife. I was done. The first thing I did when I could hold a laptop was log into my banking app. It was 5 days after the accident. My parents hadn't called. They hadn't texted to ask if I'd survived the nuisance of my internal bleeding. I looked at the scheduled transfers. $2,400 set for the 1st of the month. $800 set for the 15th. I didn't hesitate. I didn't feel a pang of guilt. I clicked cancel. Cancel. Delete. I watched the success notification flash on the screen, and for the first time in nearly a decade, I felt like I could actually draw a full breath. I blocked their numbers. I blocked Vanessa. I felt like I was cutting an umbilical cord that had been strangling me for 34 years. Marcus came by that afternoon, bringing a decent cup of coffee from the place down the street. He'd been the one who took the screenshots of that group chat for me. He knew exactly what had been said. "You look different," he said, pulling up a chair. "The monitors say your heart rate is finally normal." "I just stopped carrying 3 adults on my back, Marcus," I said, leaning back into the pillows. "It turns out, $3,200 a month buys a lot of peace. They're going to notice, Myra. People like that don't just go away when the money stops. They'll realize the well is dry, and they'll come looking for the person who turned off the tap." "Let them," I said. "I've spent 8 years being the burden. It's time they learned what a real burden looks like." I spent 2 weeks in a quiet, beautiful cocoon of recovery. No drama. No demands. The emergency nanny service I'd hired from my hospital bed was worth every penny of the triple rate fee. They kept my children safe while the people who shared my DNA were likely still humming Taylor Swift songs in their sleep. But Marcus was right. The storm was coming. I was home, moving slowly through my kitchen, making pancakes for the twins, when the first thunderclap hit. It wasn't a call. It wasn't a text. It was a knock on the door. Not the frantic, demanding knock of my mother or the heavy, authoritative thump of my father. It was 3 sharp, rhythmic raps. The kind of knock you hear from someone who spent 40 years presiding over a federal courtroom. I froze, the spatula midair. I looked through the peephole, and my breath caught. Standing on my porch was a man I hadn't seen in 3 years. Thomas Carver. My grandfather. The man my parents had spent years telling me was too frail and too confused to see me. He stood there, leaning on a silver-headed cane, looking exactly like the judge who had once sent a governor to prison. I opened the door, and before I could speak, he looked at me with eyes that were as sharp and clear as a winter morning. "Myra," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "I just heard about the concert. And I think it's time we discussed the Carver legacy. Because as far as I can see, I'm the only one who didn't forget you were bleeding out on a Tuesday." I looked at the folder he was clutching in his free hand. It was thick, manila, and stamped with the seal of a federal law office. "Grandpa?" I whispered, pulling him into the kitchen. "How did you find me?" "Aunt Eleanor called," he said, taking a seat at my table. "She's the only one in the family who still knows how to tell a lie from a fact. And I want you to tell me something, Myra. I want you to tell me exactly how much it costs to keep a house standing for people who don't want to keep you alive." The coffee machine gurgled in the corner. I sat down, my hands trembling around my mug. The financial autopsy was about to begin. Grandpa Thomas didn't move like a man who was 82. He moved like a mountain that had decided to relocate. He sat at my small kitchen table, his silver-headed cane hooked over the back of the chair, and watched my children play with a gaze so sharp it felt like it was peeling back the layers of the last decade. Lily was showing him a half-chewed plastic dinosaur. Lucas was trying to climb his leg. For a man my parents claimed was drifting into senility, he seemed more anchored to reality than anyone I'd met in years. "They told me you were too busy for visits, Myra," he said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated the wood of the table. "They told me your residency had made you distant. That you didn't want the burden of an old man's company while you were climbing the social ladder of the medical world." I felt a cold prickle of shame, not for myself, but for the people who shared my blood. "I called every month, Grandpa. Mom always said you were sleeping, or that the doctors had restricted your visitors. I sent photos of the twins. Dozens of them." Thomas Carver reached into the thick manila folder on the table and pulled out a stack of unopened envelopes. My handwriting stared back at me. The loopy I'd practiced since high school, the colorful stickers I'd let the twins put on the back of the cards. All of them were marked "Return to Sender." Not by the post office. By a black felt-tip marker I recognized instantly. My mother's hand. "She wasn't just taking your money, Myra," he whispered, his eyes flashing with a predatory brilliance. "She was curated in isolation. She wanted you to feel alone so that you'd keep paying for the privilege of being part of a family that didn't exist." I sat down, the weight of the revelation hitting me harder than the truck had. It wasn't just favoritism. It wasn't just Vanessa's fragile ego. It was a calculated, strategic blockade. They had hollowed out my life from both ends, draining my bank account to fund their lifestyle while cutting off the only source of unconditional love I had left. "Why now, Grandpa?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Why show up today?" "Because Aunt Eleanor doesn't like Taylor Swift," he said with a grim, mirthless smile. "She saw the group chat on Helen's phone while they were getting ready for the concert. She saw that text, Myra. The one where they called a bleeding woman a nuisance. She drove to my house at midnight and woke me up. She told me that if I didn't step in now, I'd be burying a granddaughter who died believing she was unloved." He pushed the folder toward me. "I've spent 40 years on the federal bench, Myra. I know how to follow a paper trail. I want you to open your banking app. I want you to show me the numbers. Because if Richard and Helen want to play a game of nuisance and burden, I think it's time we showed them what a real legal burden looks like." I opened the app. I showed him the 8 years of automatic transfers. I showed him the car repairs, the roof leaks, the Vanessa emergencies. As the numbers scrolled past, the silence in the kitchen grew heavy, suffocating. Grandpa Thomas didn't gasp. He didn't swear. He just watched the screen with the terrifying, clinical focus of a man who was already writing a sentencing memorandum in his head. $320,000, he muttered, his thumb tracing the gold head of his cane. "And they're living in a house they don't own, driving cars they didn't buy, while mocking the woman who kept the lights on. He looked up at me, and for a second, the judge was gone, replaced by the grandfather who used to take me fishing when I was 6. You've been a doctor for 3 years, Myra. You know how to stop a hemorrhage. It's time you applied that skill to your family. I'm hosting a dinner for my 70th birthday next Saturday. The whole family will be there. Vanessa. Your parents. The aunts, the uncles, the cousins who've been told you're the difficult one. Grandpa, I don't want a scene. I just want them gone. This isn't about a scene, Myra, he said, standing up, his cane striking the floor with the finality of a gavel. This is about an autopsy. We're going to open up the Carver family and show everyone exactly what's been rotting inside for a decade. Bring your spreadsheet. Bring your bank statements. And Myra? Wear your white coat. I want them to remember exactly who it is they decided wasn't worth a 4-minute phone call. The week leading up to the party was the longest of my life. I went back to work, moving slowly, the surgical staples in my abdomen a constant, biting reminder of the Tuesday night I almost lost everything. Marcus was there every day, checking my vitals, bringing me tea, and watching me with a look that was becoming harder and harder to categorize as just a colleague. You're really going to do it? He asked one afternoon in the quiet of the residence lounge. The full disclosure? They're already telling people I've had a mental breakdown, Marcus, I said, looking at a printout of my bank statements. Vanessa's been calling our cousins, saying the accident scrambled my brain and that's why I've cut them off. They're building a defense before I've even filed a charge. Then you hit them with the facts, he said, leaning against the doorframe. In my world, if a patient is flatlining, you don't offer them a blanket. You shock the heart. This dinner? It's the paddles, Myra. Clear. I spent my evenings organizing the data. I didn't just print the statements, I made a timeline. I mapped their vacations against my double shifts. I mapped Vanessa's designer bag purchases against the weeks I'd skipped meals to make sure the mortgage transfer went through. I saw it all in black and white, a parasitic relationship masked as family loyalty. The most devastating part wasn't the money. It was the dates. I found the day I'd called them crying from the NICU when the twins were born early. The transfer for $2,400 went out that same afternoon. My mother's response to my plea for help was a text about a sale at Nordstrom. By Friday night, the manila folder was thick enough to be a weapon. I sat on my floor, surrounded by the twins' toys, and realized that for 8 years, I had been the practical one because it made it easier for them to ignore my humanity. If I was a machine, machines don't need hugs. Machines don't need someone to watch their kids while they're in surgery. Machines just need maintenance. I looked at the Taylor Swift text one last time before archiving it. Figure it out yourself. I did, Mom, I whispered to the empty room. I figured out that you're not a mother. You're a landlord. And your tenant is moving out. I didn't feel the surge of triumph I expected. I felt a hollow, aching grief for the girl I used to be. The one who aced every exam just to see her father nod once. The one who thought med school was the ticket to being enough. I realized now that there was no enough for people like Richard and Helen Carver. There was only more. I packed my bag for the party. My navy blue dress. My stethoscope, a petty addition, perhaps, but a necessary reminder of the life I'd built without them. I looked at the twins, sleeping soundly in their cribs, and I made a silent vow. They would never know what it felt like to be a nuisance. They would never draw their value from the balance of a bank account. I was ready to go to Grandpa Thomas's estate. I was ready to face the whispers, the pitying looks, and the curated lies. But as I checked the Blackwood Circle group chat one last time, I saw a new message from Vanessa. So excited for Grandpa's big 7-0. Let's make sure we're all extra nice to Myra tonight, guys. The doctors say she's still delusional about the accident. Just nod and smile. I felt a cold, sharp laugh bubble up in my throat. They were so confident. They thought they were the ones who controlled the narrative. They had no idea that the practical daughter was about to perform the most precise surgery of her career. And I wasn't using a scalpel. I was using a ledger. The Carver estate was a colonial monolith of white columns and manicured lawns, a place that breathed old money and quiet authority. As I pulled into the circular driveway, my hands were steady on the wheel, but my heart was drumming a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Marcus was in the passenger seat. He'd insisted on coming as my medical escort, though we both knew he was there to be my witness. "Look at them," Marcus said, nodding toward the wraparound porch. "The whole hive is here." I could see them through the massive windows. My parents, Richard and Helen, were holding court near the fireplace, looking every bit the dignified couple. Vanessa was flitting between aunts and uncles, her designer dress a splash of vibrant silk against the subdued colors of the room. I could almost hear the whispers from here. "Poor Myra. So sad. A breakdown, you know. Ready?" Marcus asked, his hand momentarily covering mine on the gearshift. "Clear," I said, echoing his words from earlier. We walked into the foyer, and the change in the room was instantaneous. The laughter didn't die, it curdled. It turned into that polite, strained silence you offer to a stranger at a funeral. My mother was the first to move, gliding across the room with a look of practiced, tragic concern. "Myra, sweetheart," she said, reaching out to touch my arm. I stepped back, and her hand hung in the air, a useless, pale thing. "We were so worried you wouldn't make it. You look tired. Perhaps you should sit in the study? It's quieter there." "I'm fine, Mother," I said, my voice carrying further than she liked. The surgery was a success. No thanks to the Taylor Swift concert, of course. A few heads turned. My father's face went a dusty shade of red. Vanessa appeared at my mother's side, her eyes darting to Marcus, then to the folder clutched under my arm. "Myra, don't be like that," Vanessa whispered, her voice a sharp hiss under a sugary coating. "This is Grandpa's night. Don't make one of your scenes. We all know you've been confused lately." "Confused?" I asked, pulling the folder out. "Is that what you're telling everyone? That the internal bleeding scrambled my brains?" "We just want you to get help, honey," my father said, stepping forward, his voice projected for the benefit of the watching cousins. "The way you've been acting, cutting us off, canceling the family support, it's not you. We forgive you, of course. We know it's the stress." I looked around the room. I saw my Aunt Eleanor near the bar, her eyes narrowed, watching the exchange. I saw my cousins, their faces a mixture of pity and judgment. They had been fed a diet of lies for 2 weeks, and they were full. "You forgive me?" I asked, a cold, hard laugh escaping me. "That's fascinating, Dad. Because I spent my recovery time doing a little light reading. I went through the last 8 years of our family support." "Myra, not here," my mother pleaded, her eyes darting to the front door as if she could wish me back through it. "Why not here? We're family, right? And family shares everything." I opened the folder. I pulled out the first page, the summary of the $320,000. "Since you're all so worried about my mental state, I thought I'd share the data that's been confusing me." I walked to the center of the room, right under the massive crystal chandelier. I felt the surgical staples pull at my skin, but I didn't care. The adrenaline was a better painkiller than the morphine ever was. 8 years ago, I began, my voice clear and clinical. My parents asked for help with a mortgage payment. "Just this once," they said. That once has lasted 96 months. Totaling $230,000. The room went deathly silent. My mother's hand went to her throat. My father looked like he wanted to vanish into the floorboards. "Health insurance premiums?" $76,000, I continued, flipping the page. "Vanessa's studio launch in 2021? $12,000. Total Carver family investment? $364,200. Paid for by the nuisance and the burden who was bleeding out in an ambulance while you were screaming for an encore in Section 102. That's enough, my father roared, his dignified mask finally cracking. You're twisted, Myra. To keep a tally on your own parents? To throw money in our faces in front of your grandfather? Oh, I'm not throwing it in your face, Dad, I said, stepping closer to him. I'm just clarifying the account. Because if I'm delusional, then these bank transfers must be imaginary. If I'm a burden, then I assume you have the $300,000 ready to pay me back. Since you've been managing so well without me? Vanessa stepped forward, her face twisted with a feral kind of rage. You think you're so much better than us because you have a degree? You're a cold, heartless bitch, Myra. You've always been jealous of me, and now you're trying to destroy Mom and Dad because you can't buy the love they give me for free. Is that what you call it, Vanessa? Free? I looked at her, and for the first time I didn't see the visionary. I saw a 37-year-old toddler. The only reason your life is free is because I've been paying the bill. But the subscription has ended. I looked at my mother. She was shaking, her eyes darting around the room, looking for an escape, for a way to rewrite the scene. But then, the heavy thud of a cane echoed from the top of the stairs. Grandpa Thomas stood there, looking down at the wreckage of his family. He didn't look surprised. He didn't look angry. He looked like a man who had just finished watching a long, tedious trial and was ready to read the verdict. Richard. Helen, Grandpa Thomas said, his voice echoing in the hollow silence of the house. I've heard enough about Myra's delusions. Now, I want to hear about the lockboxes. My mother's face didn't just go pale, it went ashen. She looked at Grandpa Thomas, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Lockboxes? I asked, turning to my grandfather. What lockboxes? Grandpa Thomas began to descend the stairs, his eyes never leaving my mother's face. The ones your mother tried to move out of my house last night while she thought I was sleeping. The ones full of the emergency funds she's been skimming off your transfers for 8 years. I felt the room tilt again. It wasn't just that they were using my money to live. It was that they were hoarding it. Grandpa, I whispered. How much? Grandpa Thomas reached the bottom of the stairs and looked at me, a grim, satisfied smile on his face. Enough to buy a Taylor Swift stadium, Myra. But not enough to buy their way out of what I'm about to do to the will. The silence in the Carver estate didn't just grow, it solidified, becoming a physical barrier between the 3 people at the center of the room and the 40 relatives who were watching their world dissolve in real time. My mother's hand was still gripped around her pearl necklace, her knuckles white, her eyes darting toward the heavy mahogany doors of the study as if she could bolt through them and vanish. But Grandpa Thomas was standing in her path, his silver-headed cane planted firmly on the Persian rug like a territorial marker. Lockboxes, Helen? Grandpa's voice was a low, dangerous purr. I watched you through the security feed. You thought I was sedated, tucked away in my wing. But I saw you and Richard dragging those heavy steel cases out of my basement at 2 a.m. You weren't moving family heirlooms. You were moving a mountain of cash that didn't belong to you. I felt the room tilt. The spreadsheet in my hand suddenly felt light, insufficient. I had been tallying the money I'd sent them to keep their lights on, but I hadn't realized I was funding a private treasury. I looked at my father, Richard. He wasn't the dignified patriarch anymore. He was a man who had been caught with his hand in the vault, his face a mottled, ugly purple. It's our inheritance, Dad, my father shouted, his voice cracking with a desperate, frantic greed. You've been sitting on that fortune for decades. Myra has more money than she knows what to do with, she's a cardiologist. We were just balancing the scales. We were making sure Vanessa had a future while you were hoarding everything for a legacy that doesn't exist. Balancing the scales? I whispered, stepping closer to him, the surgical staples in my side burning like hot needles. You told me you couldn't afford a roof over your head. You told me the bank was going to take the house. I worked 80-hour shifts, Dad. I missed my children's first steps because I was covering the emergencies you manufactured. And all the while, you were skimming my transfers and stashing them in a basement? While I was bleeding out on a Tuesday, were you worried about my life, or were you worried about who would fund the next lockbox? Vanessa stepped forward then, her designer heels clicking sharply against the hardwood. She didn't look ashamed. She looked indignant. You're so dramatic, Myra. So you paid for some things, big deal. You have a career. I have a vision. Mom and Dad were just making sure the Carver name actually meant something in the world of fashion. Do you know how much a runway show costs? Do you know the pressure I'm under? You just walk into a hospital and follow a script. I have to create. You created a heist, Vanessa, Marcus said from behind me, his voice a calm, clinical observation that seemed to infuriate her more than my rage. You didn't just take her money. You took her time. You took her peace of mind. That's not fashion. That's a long con. Grandpa Thomas raised his cane, and the room went instantly quiet. The lockboxes are currently in the back of my SUV, Richard. I had the groundskeeper move them back while you were busy pitying Myra in the foyer. I've already had a forensic accountant friend take a cursory look. There's nearly $200,000 in cash and bearer bonds in those cases. Money that was funneled directly from Myra's mortgage payments over the last 5 years. He looked at my parents, his eyes as cold as a winter morning on the bench. You didn't just fail as parents. You failed as humans. You used a medical emergency to mock a woman who was literally keeping your hearts beating. And as of tonight, the will is no longer practical. It's gone. The social execution was swifter than any legal trial I'd ever witnessed. As Grandpa Thomas read the Taylor Swift text out loud to the entire room, his voice booming with the authority of a man who had spent 40 years delivering verdicts, the physical shift in the room was breathtaking. The aunts and uncles who had been whispering about my mental breakdown 5 minutes ago were now literally stepping away from my parents, creating a wide, empty circle of shame around them. Figure it out yourself, Grandpa repeated, the words hanging in the air like a death sentence. That was your response to a daughter in an ambulance. Well, Richard, Helen, it's time for you to follow your own advice. Figure it out yourselves. Grandpa, please, my mother sobbed, her carefully curated facade finally collapsing into a mess of smeared mascara and ruined silk. We were stressed. We didn't think it was that bad. Myra always makes things out to be more than they are. I almost died, Mom, I said, my voice sounding flat, even to my own ears. The anger was being replaced by a strange, hollowed-out clarity. I was minutes away from never seeing Lily and Lucas again. And you were worried about a set list. You weren't stressed. You were bored. Bored with the practical daughter and her practical problems. You wanted the glitz, and you wanted me to pay for the tickets. I looked at my sister. Vanessa, I hope the concert was worth it. Because it's the last thing I'm ever going to buy you. I'm filing for a full financial audit. I want every cent of that lockbox money returned to the twins' college fund. And if I find out you've touched a dime of the insurance money I've been paying, I'll see you in court, and I won't be there as a doctor. I'll be there as a creditor. Vanessa's face went white. She looked at our father, but Richard was staring at the floor, his shoulders slumped, the realization of his total social and financial ruin finally sinking in. The visionary and the patriarch were suddenly just two people in expensive clothes with nowhere to go. Leave, Grandpa Thomas commanded. The party is over for you. Richard, I want your keys to the lake house on the table. Helen, your access to the family trust is revoked as of this moment. You have 48 hours to vacate the property on Carver Lane. Since Myra paid for it, she's the one who will decide what happens to the deed. My father looked up, his eyes bloodshot and wide. Carver Lane? That's our home. You can't put us on the street. It's not your home, I said, stepping into his line of sight. It's a nuisance. And it's a burden. And as you said, you're used to handling things on your own. So, go handle it. They walked out then, a slow, pathetic procession through the foyer. Vanessa led the way, her head held high in a final, delusional act of defiance, but my parents looked like ghosts haunting their own lives. As the heavy front door clicked shut behind them, a collective exhale swept through the room. Marcus reached out and touched my shoulder. "You okay?" "I'm clear, Marcus," I said, looking at the folder on the table. For the first time in 34 years, the air is finally clear. But as the guests began to murmur and drift back toward the bar, Grandpa Thomas beckoned me over to the study. He looked tired, the adrenaline of the sentencing fading to reveal the toll the betrayal had taken on him. "There's one more thing, Myra," he said, his voice a low whisper as he closed the heavy oak doors. The lockboxes, they weren't just full of cash. The study felt like a sanctuary after the bright, jagged theater of the foyer. Grandpa Thomas sat in his high-backed leather chair, the one that still smelled of old books and judicial gravity. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a small, velvet-lined box that he'd taken from one of the steel cases. "I found this at the bottom of the third lockbox," he said, handing it to me. I opened it. Inside wasn't a roll of $100 bills or a bearer bond. It was a necklace. A delicate, vintage piece of emeralds and gold that I recognized instantly. It was my grandmother's. The one my mother had told me was lost in a move years ago. The one she'd promised would be mine when I graduated med school, only to tell me later that it had been stolen by a housekeeper. "She didn't just steal your money, Myra," Grandpa said, his voice thick with a quiet, simmering rage. "She stole your history. She was hawkshopping the family's soul to pay for Vanessa's runway dreams while telling you that you were the one who was too practical for sentiment." I touched the cold green stones, feeling a fresh wave of grief. It wasn't the money. It was the calculated cruelty of it. To tell me my heritage was gone while she was stashing it in a basement like a common thief. "I've already called the firm," Grandpa continued. "We're initiating a full investigation into the mortgage fraud. Richard has been signing your name on equity lines for years, Myra. That's why the emergencies kept happening. He wasn't just paying the mortgage, he was borrowing against the house you were buying for them to fund Vanessa's lifestyle." I felt the room start to spin. Identity theft. Fraud. They hadn't just been leeches, they had been criminals. I looked at the spreadsheet on the desk. The $320,000 was just the tip of the iceberg. "How deep does it go, Grandpa?" "Deep enough to put them away if you want to push it," he said, watching me closely. "But there's something else you need to see. Something I found in Richard's private files while I was looking for the deeds." He handed me a final, thin piece of paper. It was a life insurance policy. One I'd never seen before. One that had been taken out 3 years ago, right after the twins were born. I looked at the beneficiary line. Richard and Helen Carver. I looked at the insured name. Myra Whitmore. But it was the writer on the policy that made my blood turn to ice. It was a high-risk occupation clause, specifically citing my long shifts and commute as a cardiology resident. And there, in the fine print, was a double indemnity clause for accidental death. "They weren't just waiting for you to fund their life, Myra," Grandpa whispered, his voice sounding like a ghost in the quiet room. "When you called from that ambulance, they didn't just see a nuisance. They saw a payout." I looked at the date the policy had been last updated. It was 2 weeks before my accident. My hand went to my phone, the "figure it out yourself" text flashing in my mind. The laughing emoji. The concert. I looked at Marcus, who was standing by the door, his face pale. "They weren't coming to the hospital," I whispered, the realization finally breaking me. "They were waiting for the call from the morgue." Suddenly, my phone buzzed in my pocket. A new message from an unknown number. I swiped the screen, my breath hitching. "Myra, we know about the basement. You think you've won? Check the twins' nanny's background. We weren't the only ones who knew how to find the Carver legacy." I looked at Grandpa, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. "The nanny," I rasped. "Grandpa, the emergency service, my mother suggested that specific agency 6 months ago. She said they were the best. I hit the call button for the nanny, my fingers shaking so hard I nearly dropped the phone. It rang once. Twice. 3 times. Then, a voice answered. It wasn't the nanny. It was Vanessa. "Hey, sis," she whispered, her voice a poisonous, melodic purr. "The concert was great, but the encore is even better. Do you want to hear them scream, or should I just figure it out myself?" The silence in Grandpa Thomas's study didn't just grow. It pressurized, turning the air into something thick and unbreathable. I stared at the phone in my hand, the display glowing with Vanessa's name, her voice still vibrating in my ear like a hornet trapped in a jar. "Do you want to hear them scream, or should I just figure it out myself?" My surgical staples felt like they were being ripped out one by one. The betrayal of the money was one thing. The theft of the jewelry was another. But my children? Lily and Lucas were the only 2 things in this world I hadn't attached a price tag to, the only parts of my life that hadn't been leveraged to pay for a designer gown or a mortgage on a lie. "Vanessa," I rasped, my voice sounding like it was being dragged over broken glass. "If you so much as touch them, if you even breathe in their direction, I will spend every cent of the Carver fortune to make sure you never see the sun again." I heard a soft, melodic laugh on the other end. It was the sound of a woman who had finally found the one thing she could create better than fashion: chaos. "Oh, Myra. Always so practical. Always so clinical. You think a bank statement is a weapon? You think Grandpa's little sentencing in the foyer actually changed anything? Mom and Dad are in the driveway crying, but I'm the one who actually knows how to play the long game. You've been paying for my life for 8 years, sis. Did you really think I wouldn't have a backup plan for when the ATM ran dry?" Beside me, Marcus was already on his phone, his face a grim mask of professional focus. He was calling the precinct, his voice low and urgent, but I knew the math. The Carver estate was 40 minutes from my apartment. Even with sirens, even with the pedal to the floor, we were fighting a clock that Vanessa had been winding for months. "The nanny service, Vanessa," I said, my heart hammering a frantic, erratic rhythm against my ribs. "The elite care agency Mom suggested. You planted someone, didn't you? You didn't just wait for an accident. You were waiting for an opening. Mom is a genius at the small details, Myra. She knew you'd never check the background of a girl she personally vetted for her precious grandchildren. Sarah isn't a nanny. She's an aspiring model I met at a casting call in Milan. She's very good at following scripts. And right now, the script says Lily and Lucas are going for a little midnight adventure while Mommy is busy being the hero of the Carver estate." The line went dead. I looked at Grandpa Thomas. The retired federal judge looked like he had aged 20 years in 20 seconds. The man who had presided over the most dangerous cartels in the country was trembling, his hand white-knuckled around the head of his cane. "The security feed," I whispered, lunging for his desk. "Grandpa, the live link to my apartment. You set it up for me last year when I started the overnight shifts." With shaking fingers, I pulled up the app. The screen flickered to life. My living room. The small, familiar space where Lily's toy blocks were still scattered on the rug. The high-backed chair where I sat to read them stories. It was empty. The lights were on, but the silence captured by the tiny microphone was deafening. I swiped to the nursery feed. The cribs were empty. The blankets were tossed aside as if the twins had been lifted out in a hurry. "They're gone," I choked out, the world tilting so sharply I had to grab the edge of the mahogany desk to keep from falling. "Marcus, they're gone." The drive back to the city was a blurred nightmare of adrenaline and agony. Marcus was behind the wheel of my SUV, the engine screaming as he tore through the backroads, weaving between the late-night traffic with the precision of a man who spent his life racing against death. I sat in the passenger seat, my eyes glued to the tablet, my fingers frantically cycling through every camera feed I had. "They won't hurt them, Myra," Marcus said, his voice a steady anchor in the storm of my panic. "Vanessa is a narcissist, not a killer. She wants leverage. She wants the lockboxes back. She wants the will reinstated. She's using them as a bargaining chip because she knows you've finally cut the purse strings. You didn't see her eyes, Marcus, I whispered, watching the empty nursery on the screen. You didn't see the way she looked at me when I told her the subscription had ended. She doesn't just want the money. She wants me broken. She wants to prove that no matter how practical I am, no matter how many hearts I can fix in a lab, I can't protect my own. My phone buzzed again. An image. I clicked it, my breath hitching in my throat. It was Lily and Lucas. They were in the back of a car, a black SUV I recognized as my father's. They looked confused, their eyes wide in the flash of the camera, but they weren't crying. Not yet. Below the photo was a single GPS coordinate. The old Carver lumber mill. A sprawling, rusted skeleton of a building on the edge of the industrial district that had been sitting vacant since the 80s. It was a place of ghosts and jagged metal, a place where the city's noise died and the darkness took over. She's at the mill, I said, my voice cold with a new kind of resolve. She's not even trying to hide. She's inviting me. It's a trap, Myra. The police are 10 minutes behind us. We wait for backup. I don't have 10 minutes. If she sees a patrol car, she'll vanish into those woods, and I'll never see them again. She knows I'm coming, Marcus. She knows the practical daughter can't resist a direct summons. We pulled into the gravel lot of the mill, the headlights cutting through the thick, stagnant fog of the riverfront. The building loomed over us like a predator, its broken windows like missing teeth. And there, parked right in the center of the loading bay, was my father's car. I didn't wait for Marcus to stop. I rolled out of the car before the tires had finished crunching the gravel, the pain in my abdomen a distant, muffled secondary thought. I ran toward the open bay, the scent of rot and wet sawdust filling my lungs. Vanessa! I screamed into the cavernous dark. I'm here. I have the folder. I have the codes. Just give me my children. My voice echoed up into the rafters, bouncing off the rusted machinery and the rotting wood. For a long, terrifying minute, the only response was the drip of water from a leaky pipe. Then, the sound of a slow, rhythmic clapping began. Vanessa stepped out from behind a massive, rusted circular saw. She was still wearing the designer dress, but it was torn at the hem, and her hair was a tangled mess. She looked like a fallen queen, beautiful and terrible in the half-light. You always were the fast one, Myra, she said, her voice amplified by the acoustics of the mill. Top of the class. First to the finish line. But you forgot one thing about medicine. Sometimes, the treatment is more painful than the disease. She stepped aside, and my heart nearly stopped. Behind her, tied to a wooden chair with a thick, yellow nylon rope, wasn't my children. It was my mother. Helen Carver sat in the chair, her mouth taped shut, her eyes wide with a frantic, animalistic terror I had never seen before. Her cream-colored dress was stained with grease and dirt. She looked at me, a muffled, desperate sound vibrating in her throat. Surprised? Vanessa asked, circling the chair like a shark. You thought I was working with them? Please. Mom and Dad are as useless as you are. They were going to take the lockboxes and run to Uncle Frank's. They were going to leave me with nothing, Myra. They were going to figure it out for themselves and leave the visionary to drown in the debt they encouraged. I stood frozen, the manila folder clutched to my chest. Where are the twins, Vanessa? Where are they? They're safe. For now. Sarah has them at a motel 3 towns over. But here's the thing about elite care, Myra. They only follow the person who pays the bill. And right now, I've told Sarah that if she doesn't hear from me every 20 minutes, she's to take the kids to the safe haven drop-off in the city. You know the ones. No questions asked. Anonymous. They'll be in the system before the sun comes up. You'll spend the next 10 years trying to find them in a sea of red tape. I felt the room spin. The calculated cruelty was breathtaking. She wasn't just holding them, she was threatening to erase them, just like she'd tried to erase me. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice trembling. "I want the trust, Myra. I want the power of attorney over Grandpa's estate. And I want you to sign a confession. A full, written statement saying you embezzled the money from the Carver business and framed Mom and Dad to cover your tracks. I want my reputation back. I want my life back." She stepped toward my mother, her hand reaching out to stroke Helen's hair with a terrifying tenderness. "And Mom? Mom is going to help us. Aren't you, Mom? You're going to tell the police that Myra went crazy, that she kidnapped you, and that I was the one who saved you. We're going to be the victims again. It's what we're best at." Helen let out a broken sob behind the tape. "You're insane," I whispered. "No," Vanessa hissed, her eyes flashing with a cold, blue fire. "I'm a designer. And I'm designing a new ending for this family. One where the practical daughter is the one who ends up behind bars." She pulled a small, silver lighter from her pocket and flicked it open. The flame danced in the dark, reflecting in the pools of stagnant water on the floor. She looked at a stack of old, oil-soaked rags piled at the base of my mother's chair. "Sign the papers, Myra. Or I let the past burn down. Starting with the woman who taught me that love is a transaction." I looked at Marcus, who was moving silently through the shadows behind the machinery, his eyes locked on mine. He was waiting for a signal. But as I looked back at Vanessa, I realized she wasn't looking at the lighter. She was looking at the phone in her other hand. The 20-minute timer. "Wait," I said, stepping forward. I'll sign everything. Just, let me see them. FaceTime Sarah. Let me see their faces one last time before I lose everything." Vanessa smiled, a slow, predatory grin. She tapped the screen of her phone, the ringing tone echoing through the mill. But as the connection clicked through, the image that appeared on the screen wasn't a motel room. It was the back of a police cruiser. And sitting in the front seat, looking directly into the camera with a look of absolute, icy calm, was Grandpa Thomas. "Hello, Vanessa," he said, his voice sounding like a bell tolling in the dark. "I believe you're looking for Sarah? She's currently explaining the Milan contract to a very interested district attorney." Vanessa's face didn't just go pale, it went gray. She looked at the phone, then at me, the lighter trembling in her hand. "You think you won?" she screamed, her voice cracking into a high-pitched, desperate shriek. "You think you can just take it all away?" She dropped the lighter. The oil-soaked rags didn't just catch, they erupted. A wall of fire surged up between us, the heat hitting me like a physical blow. But it wasn't my mother she was looking at. Vanessa turned and ran toward the back of the mill, toward the open ledge that hung over the churning, black water of the river 60 feet below. "Vanessa, stop!" I screamed, lunging through the smoke. But as I reached the edge, I saw her silhouette against the moonlight. She wasn't jumping. She was pointing at the water. "The car, Myra," she yelled over the roar of the fire. "Check the trunk of the car in the water." I looked down, and my blood turned to ice. There, half submerged in the mud of the riverbank, was a second black SUV. And the taillights were still blinking. The roar of the fire behind me was a physical weight, a wall of heat trying to push me over the edge into the black, churning throat of the river. But the sound that truly broke me wasn't the crackle of burning oil, it was the rhythmic, mechanical click-click-click of the hazard lights reflecting off the muddy water 60 feet below. A black SUV, identical to my father's, nose down in the silt. "The car, Myra!" Vanessa's voice was a jagged shriek, barely audible over the wind and the flames. She was backed against the rusted railing of the loading bay, her designer dress tattered, her face a mask of manic triumph. "You were so worried about Sarah and the motel. You forgot about Dad's backup. You forgot that he's been drowning in debt for years. He didn't just want the insurance money, he wanted the collateral. I didn't think. I couldn't afford the luxury of a heartbeat. I turned away from the fire, away from my mother's muffled screams in the chair, and I ran. My surgical staples felt like they were being unstitched by a hot blade, a searing agony that radiated through my abdomen with every step, but I didn't stop. I plummeted down the rotted wooden stairs of the mill, my boots slipping on slick moss and wet sawdust, until I hit the riverbank. The mud was like cold grease, sucking at my legs, trying to pull me under. I lunged toward the submerged vehicle, the water rising to my waist, then my chest. The current was an animal, a heavy, cold muscle trying to sweep me into the dark. I reached the trunk, my fingers frantic, clawing at the latch. It was locked. "Marcus!" I screamed, the sound lost in the roar of the river. I looked back up at the mill. Marcus was a shadow against the orange glow of the fire, cutting my mother loose, pulling her toward the exit. He couldn't hear me. I was alone. I grabbed a rusted iron pipe from the silt and slammed it against the rear window. 1 strike. 2. The glass didn't break, it just mocked me with a dull thud. I went under, the freezing water filling my nose and throat, my lungs screaming for air. I found a rock, a heavy, jagged piece of granite, and I brought it up with every ounce of a mother's desperate strength. The glass shattered. I reached into the dark, flooded cabin, my hands searching the seats, the floorboards, the void. And then, I felt it. A soft, wet bundle. A small hand. I pulled. I pulled until my muscles cramped, until my vision blurred with the effort. I broke the surface, gasping, clutching a car seat. In it was Lucas. His eyes were closed, his face a terrifying, translucent blue. I didn't stop to breathe. I went back in. I found Lily. I dragged them both to the muddy bank, my body shaking so hard I could barely stand. I collapsed in the muck, my heart a frantic, dying bird in my chest. I tilted their heads back. I cleared their mouths. I started the compressions. 1, 2, 3, 4. "Please," I whispered, the word a sob that tasted of river water and blood. "Please, don't take them. Take the money. Take the legacy. Just let them breathe." 30 seconds passed. A lifetime. Then, a sharp, ragged cough. Lucas sputtered, a fountain of gray water erupting from his lungs. Seconds later, Lily followed, a high, thin wail that was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. I pulled them into my arms, the freezing mud and the heat of the fire above us creating a world of impossible contrasts. I looked up. The mill was a torch now, a beacon of orange light against the black sky. And there, at the very edge of the loading bay, I saw a silhouette. Vanessa. She wasn't running. She was standing still, watching me. She saw the twins. She saw me. And for the first time in 34 years, the ice in her eyes seemed to melt into something that looked like realization. She stepped back. The railing, weakened by decades of rust and the sudden, intense heat of the fire, gave way. There was no scream. Just a soft splash as the river claimed the visionary and her designer dreams. The aftermath of that night felt like a long, slow recovery from a fever. The Carver estate was liquidated within 48 hours. My father, Richard, was arrested at a bus station in the next state, the remaining lockbox money hidden in a false-bottomed suitcase. He didn't even ask about the twins. He just wanted to know if the bearer bonds were still valid. My mother, Helen, survived the fire with second-degree burns and a permanent, haunting silence. She was charged as an accessory, but the doctors at the psych ward say she's retreated into a world where it's always Tuesday and the Taylor Swift tickets are still in her purse. She doesn't recognize my voice anymore. She doesn't recognize the burden she tried to trade for a payout. Vanessa was found 3 miles downstream. She was still wearing the emerald necklace, grandmother's necklace. The one she'd stolen and hidden in the lockbox. It was wrapped around her neck, tangled in the silt, a final, cold piece of jewelry for a woman who could never have enough. Grandpa Thomas oversaw the dismantling of the Carver name with a clinical, judicial fury. Every cent that could be recovered was placed into a protected trust for Lily and Lucas. He moved into a smaller house, a quiet place near the coast, and he never spoke my parents' names again. I sat in my new living room, 6 months later, watching the twins play on the rug. The apartment was smaller than the one I'd had before, much smaller than the Carver estate, but the air felt different. It felt light. Marcus was in the kitchen, making coffee. He'd stayed through the surgeries, through the police statements, through the long, hollow nights when the sound of the river still echoed in my ears. He didn't ask for a spreadsheet. He didn't ask for a transfer. He just showed up. "You're doing it again," he said, leaning against the doorframe, handing me a mug. "Doing what?" "Thinking about the math." I looked at the folder on the coffee table. The final forensic audit. $364,200. That was the price of the life I'd bought for them. That was the cost of the subscription that had almost cost me my soul. "I was just thinking," I said, taking a sip of the coffee. "For 34 years, I thought I was the practical one because I was the only one who could handle the weight. I thought love was something you earned by being useful, by being the one who never broke." I looked at Lily and Lucas. They were stacking blocks, laughing as they fell. They didn't care about medical degrees or fashion contracts or federal judges. They just cared that I was there. "I wasn't practical," I whispered. "I was a hostage. I was paying a ransom for a family that had already executed the prisoner." "And now?" Marcus asked. "Now the account is closed." I picked up the manila folder, the ledger of 8 years of betrayal, and I walked to the fireplace. I didn't feel the surge of triumph I'd expected. I just felt a profound, quiet relief. I tossed the papers into the flames. I watched the $2,400 transfers curl into ash. I watched the Vanessa emergencies turn into smoke. I watched the life insurance policy, the one that put a price on my accidental death, vanish into the soot. Boundaries aren't a betrayal. I know that now. Saying no isn't an act of war, it's an act of survival. I spent a decade trying to buy a seat at a table where I was always meant to be the main course. But the table is gone now. And the only people I'm carrying are the 2 little humans who think I'm a hero, not because I'm a cardiologist, but because I'm their mom. The final piece of the Carver legacy didn't come from a lawyer or a bank. It came in a small, battered wooden box that Grandpa Thomas brought over on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. He sat at my kitchen table, the same way he had the day he'd begun the autopsy, and pushed the box toward me. "I found this in the safe deposit box Vanessa didn't know about," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "It was your father's. From before the debt. Before the design." I opened it. Inside were dozens of Polaroids. Not of Vanessa's fashion shows. Not of the high society parties. They were of me. Me at 5, holding a plastic stethoscope and listening to a teddy bear's heart. Me at 10, winning the regional science fair. Me at 18, receiving my acceptance letter to undergrad. On the back of every photo, in my father's original, steady handwriting, were notes. "Our doctor. The heart of the family. So proud." I stared at the photos, the tears finally breaking through. He had seen me. Once. Before the greed took over, before the practical label became an excuse to exploit me, he had actually been proud. He had known exactly who I was. "What happened, Grandpa?" I choked out, clutching the photo of the 5-year-old with the stethoscope. "Greed is a slow-growing cancer, Myra," Thomas said, his hand covering mine. "It starts with a small bind. A little help. And then, the person you were gets buried under the person you want people to think you are. Your father didn't forget you. He just couldn't afford to remember you and still look at himself in the mirror." I looked at the photo of the little girl who wanted to fix hearts. I realized then that I had succeeded. I hadn't just fixed the hearts of my patients, I had finally fixed my own. I had cut out the rot. I had stopped the hemorrhage. I stood up and walked to the window. The rain was falling against the glass, a soft, rhythmic patter that no longer sounded like a threat. It sounded like a cleansing. I looked at the twins, who were now trying to examine Grandpa Thomas with a toy thermometer. He was laughing, the sound a rare, beautiful thing in this house. I am Myra Whitmore. I am a cardiologist. I am a survivor. And for the first time in my life, I don't have to figure it out myself. I have a family that shows up. Not because I paid the bill, but because I'm worth the drive. The Carver name might be gone, but the heart? The heart is finally beating on its own.
Thank you for watching. Subscribe Family Files for more.